Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy days to come and learn a little bit about providing services to domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors in your area. So my name is Miranda Juby. I have about a decade of experience in academic libraries, mostly based in reference services, but I've dabbled in a little bit of everything. And recently left library services to go back into advocacy. So my day job right now is as a criminal justice advocate. So I work with victims of various level crimes in the criminal justice system. So that ranges all the way from like a theft at Walmart to like negligent homicide, and I provide services throughout all of that. So my focus is really on getting people the information they need. And a lot of my library skills actually really transfer well to what I do. It's all still about those connections and getting people access to information they need. When I was in my graduate program, I really focused on how domestic violence victims seek information about abuse, about how to leave, and really combined those kind of two passions I have of advocacy and libraries. So my hope for today is that I can share some of the things I've learned over the years with you all and help you improve your services to survivors in your area. So the first thing that I want to say before we get started today is that this can be really difficult material to talk about, whether you have a personal connection with this stuff or not. It is heavy material. And so I encourage you all, if you need to take a break, if you need to keep your camera off, if you need to step away from the computer, it's being recorded and I'm always available after presentations for follow-up questions. So please don't feel like if you take a break that you're going to miss something. I want to make sure you get the content in a way that is safe for you. And so I really encourage you to just, check in with yourself. If things are feeling a little heavy, you need to take a pause, please do that. And so our kind of general outline for the day is we're going to talk about identifying signs of abuse. We're going to talk about what you can do if you suspect somebody's being abused, our best practices for responding to a disclosure from somebody, and how to provide resources to our community as a whole. And some things to know about how I talk about these terms. I will tend to use and victim, survivor, target interchangeably. It is really important when we're talking with somebody who is a victim, survivor, target of domestic violence or sexual assault that we're mimicking the language that they use. So if they identify as a victim, we're using that language. If they identify as a survivor, we use that language. Since we're kind of talking generally today, you'll hear me use them interchangeably. Typically, I will use the word victim to kind of denote somebody who is still in a relationship or a situation where they are being abused or assaulted, and survivor is kind of that transition away from that. But certainly they're not limited to that definition, and people identify in a variety of different ways. They may use a word that I don't use here. And I will try my best to use gender neutral terms. So I do my best not to call victims she, her, or abusers he, him. I'm human, I slip up sometimes. It is always a work in progress. So if you do hear me say that, please know that is not an indication of anything I believe, that only victims are women and only abusers are men. It is that kind of cultural thing that's ingrained in all of us, and it's constantly a work in progress. On the same line as that, I try to use non-heteronormative examples. So trying to be all inclusive about the variety of relationships people can end up in that can still experience abuse. And then as kind of a shorthand, you'll hear me say DV, I mean domestic violence. If you hear me say SA, I mean sexual assault. It is when we talk about this subject and you're saying it a lot, having a shorthand is really helpful. You may see this language on some slides. So just so you kind of know what that acronym is, I put it here first. So the first thing that we are going to do today is a really brief activity. So if you have a piece of paper near you and a pen, or if you want to open up like a Word document on your computer, we are going to make 2 columns. And I'll give everybody just a second to get your materials that you need, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so in your first column, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to write down just the first thing that pops in your head, whether that is a word, if it's an image, if it's a sentence, just whatever that initial reaction is to what I say. So the first word is victim. And the second word is abuser. Our third word is domestic violence. And our fourth and last word is empowerment. All right, so now in that second column, I'm going to give everybody just a minute or two to kind of self-reflect. And in that second column, I want you to write down what is left out of the conversation by our initial definition of the word. So for an example, when I hear the word victim, my brain's first thought is a cis hetero white woman, mid-20s, who was attacked by a stranger. And so in my initial definition that kind of pops into my head, the people that are left out of that conversation are male victims, people who are of different races, different gender identities, different sexual orientations, different socioeconomic classes. So you kind of get the idea a little bit. So just take a minute and go through and just kind of see how you can expand your definition versus what you had initially thought. All right, so if you haven't finished your list, you can certainly go back to it later after this. But the reason that I like to start out with this activity is that it's really important when we are talking today that we are checking our implicit bias. This is something that we all have, and that first initial thought tends to be kind of our cultural norms and what we've been taught growing up, what's shown in media, and being able to be cognizant of that and expand our definition helps us be more inclusive with our conversations, with our policies, with our practices, with our communities. And so I like to start off with this just to kind of put it on your radar. We're all human. I'm human. My brain tells me a very narrow, specific definition when I think of these words. Empowerment is a really good example of this too. Empowerment, especially if we're talking about in the context of somebody who is sexually assaulted, we tend to think of them getting empowerment and justice through the criminal justice system. And that is very often not the case for people to find their path of empowerment. That process is really long. It's really re-traumatizing, and oftentimes doesn't actually result in any justice or empowerment for victims. And so being able to expand our definition of things like this can help us expand our services and our recommendations and our referrals to people to help them really truly find that empowerment. Maybe the solution is not calling the police, it is community conversations or restorative justice or telling the person to like F off. Like there is a variety of ways that people are going to feel empowerment. And so it's important that we're just kind of cognizant of the expansion of our definitions. So to make sure that we all kind of are going into this with a baseline level of understanding, we're going to talk about some signs of abuse. And I want to do a really important disclaimer here that these are just some examples. There are a variety of different ways that abuse is going to manifest. There are a variety of different ways people are going to express trauma responses. And so this is just a condensed version so that we can kind of all walk through this conversation with some same understanding of different things we might see or witness. So adult victims of domestic violence are often being put through this power and control wheel. And there's some examples on here, but things like economic abuse, you know, we all tend to think of like the physical abuse first, but there's actually a lot of research and education in the advocacy community about how physical abuse is actually a sign of a really bad perpetrator. They can't control their victim through any of these other means that are on this power and control wheel, and so they have to escalate to physical violence. That physical violence is a lot more risky for a perpetrator because they run the risk of their victim needing medical attention or having physical signs of the abuse, whereas, the intimidation, economic abuse, all of that stuff can happen on a little bit of a quieter scale. And so we're not going to often see physical marks for somebody who is a victim of domestic violence. We certainly can, but it is not frequently what we're going to witness. So some things that you might see or hear in a library, and again, these are not indicative of if you see one of these, it means somebody's being abused, but just kind of to give you a picture of the way in which some people might walk this world who are experiencing abuse. They may have a lack of decision making, and that comes from being unsafe in making decisions in their home, having somebody who has that power and control over their decision making. So they may be uneasy when being asked to make kind of those firmer decisions about things. They may have limited verbal communication because they are not allowed to talk to people. They have been pulled away from their family and friends and community. And so they might be a little bit more reserved with that. We may see bruises and injuries, but again, it's really not prominent because oftentimes if a victim does have physical signs of the abuser is going to keep them in their home until they are not showing those signs anymore. They may have a lack of financial independence. So this may come as, a mom who has overdue fines for a kiddo and doesn't have access to their money to pay those fines and needs to get them from a partner or something like that. And then another indicator of domestic violence is the way in which people talk about their relationship. So the self-blame is really prominent for victims. If there is a situation of abuse or violence or escalation, victims are blaming themselves for that, and you'll hear that in their language. It was my fault. I made them upset. I was misbehaving. I was being angry. I was acting crazy. They are going to blame themselves for the other person's behavior. And an abuser is going to do the opposite. They are going to blame their partner. And so it's a really good indicator when you hear people talk about, violent situations, kind of if you're unclear on who a perpetrator or the victim might be, who they are blaming in this situation is going to say a lot. And then we also have gaslighting. So I think we're all pretty familiar with gaslighting, but just convincing somebody that their reality is different than what it was. And gaslighting over and over and over again is going to also reinforce this lack of decision making, because if I can't trust my own brain, this other person is telling me that my memory is wrong or I misunderstood, it's going to, kind of defeat my self-confidence in my own decision making, which also then makes it incredibly hard to leave. We know that victims of domestic violence, on average, it takes about 7 tries to leave a situation. And when they are choosing to leave is the most dangerous time for them. So one of the things that we see a lot in our culture with conversations about this is, why don't they just leave? And I really encourage people to shift that sentence to, why aren't they willing to risk their life to get out of this relationship? Because that's really what we're asking people. We're asking them to risk their life and their safety to leave that situation. And there's a variety of reasons why people aren't willing to do that. They may have kids, they may be financially dependent. This may be a person they really truly love. If we went on a first date and somebody hit us on that first date, we are not going on a second date. Abusers are very good at getting victims to a place where they can use these power and control methods and they won't question it. And it starts very little and it builds up. And so this isn't somebody who, a victim doesn't necessarily hate their abuser and regret everything that's happened in that relationship. They may really truly believe that there is a good person in them because they saw that in the beginning of the relationship. And that's very hard to leave and ignore when you have that history of good times. Like, everything with an abuser is not bad. And so when we look at it as, well, they hit you, and so why don't you leave? There is a whole history there that we have to take into account on top of safety considerations. And I didn't say this in the beginning, but please feel free as we're talking to drop questions in the chat box, especially if they're relevant to what we're talking about now, or it just pops up. I know I'm guilty of question pops in my head and I hold it till the Q&A and then I forget it. So please feel free to drop them in there and we can kind of address them as they come. So the other side of adults who are experiencing domestic violence is if there are children in the home. And we know that children who witness domestic violence have an increase in challenges growing up because of witnessing that. In the state of New Hampshire where I live, if somebody is abused in the home and children are witnessing it, that's actually a reportable offense to Child Protective Services because they take it so seriously, the impact that witnessing domestic violence has on children. Some things that you might see or hear from kiddos. I don't know if anybody in here is young adult librarian or children's librarian, but there might be this expression of fear around a variety of things because things are unstable and unsafe at home. Just like an adult has trouble making decisions, kiddos might not know what's setting off one parent and be scared to do something that is going to set off that parent. They may also express a lot of anger towards a parent because, and this might not be the abuser. I think it's really important to note here, a lot of children will actually be angry at the victim because abusers are so good at what they do. They not only convince the victim that it's their fault, they'll convince family and friends, and they will convince their children. In my job, in the criminal justice system, one of the things I do is watch interviews with kiddos who have disclosed something, and sometimes it's kiddos who have witnessed domestic violence. And I, on more than one occasion, have had kiddos who come in and say, it is all mom's fault. Mom sets dad off. She's crazy. She's a jerk, because they hear their parent talk that way about their mom and they reiterate that, especially if the other parent is the one in control and they don't want to be on their bad side and kind of have that target shift towards them. Children who have been sexually assaulted or abused, we know can take a really long time to come forward about that. So you may not hear anything from kiddos when they're young about this, but there are some signs of abuse that may come up. And the example I like to give here is, at story time, you might overhear parents talking about some new behaviors. You may see this through people checking out different books. It's obviously not, again, a sign that somebody's being abused, say, because they've started wetting the bed again. That's a pretty natural thing for children to kind of regress a little bit and move forward. But it is a sign of somebody who's being sexually abused, and it's just something to be aware of. They also may have some sexual behavior that's inappropriate for their age. They may not want to be left alone with certain people, especially if that person they know is unsafe. And they may have just a general regression in behavior. So bedwetting is the one that I think most of us hear, most often, but also language is a really big one. So they might go from calling, mom and dad, and then it's mama dada, and kind of that regression in language and behavior, not wanting to go to the bathroom by themselves, saying they can't tie their shoes. And oftentimes we see this because kiddos are going to regress to an age where they were safe. They're going to act in a way where they were safe. They, were a little bit more limited, but have that safety. And then for some reason or another, whether that's a person in the home, family friend, extended relative, became unsafe. And kiddos have a lot going on in their brain. And so to them, things can be pretty simple. When it was this, I was safe. When it was this, I wasn't. And so we'll see that regression of behaviors. And then teens and adults who are sexually assaulted experience similar things, but have a little bit different language around their experience. And so that can shape their expression of what's happening. So we know that they have a higher rate of depression and anxiety, a higher rate of self-harm and suicidal thoughts. They may avoid specific places or people, whether that is because it is a direct connection to the abuse or because it just reminds them of it. A patron might not like you because your eyebrows look like they're abusers. Like, it can be so minute, but it has a very large impact on people. And so I like to just put that out there because sometimes you're like, I didn't even do anything and they just don't like me. Sometimes it has nothing to do with us, and that's okay. We also see an increase in drug and alcohol use, and I like to touch on this as well. alcohol and drugs are a really great way for abusers to maintain control over victims, whether that is because the victim had a prior drug and alcohol use issue, and so they use that to their advantage to keep them not sober, keep them in their addiction, or they force them to consume drugs and alcohol to maintain control over them. And then changing our bodies. I mean, I've gone through plenty of breakups, and I've done the thing where you chop your hair, you dye it. I think we've all been there. You change a little bit of your appearance. It is natural to do that when we are kind of going through transition. Somebody who's been sexually assaulted may want absolutely nothing to do with what their body looks like. And that can be as minor as like weight gain and loss, all the way to gender transition. There are a lot of discussions happening about people who transition their gender because they were assaulted as one gender and they're not comfortable in that body anymore and are much more comfortable living in a different body expression. And so that is also, there's a whole range there about how we can kind of change our appearance to cope with the abuse. And then people who are being stalked, I also like to throw in here because this is kind of, it can go with domestic violence, it can go with sexual assault. Those perpetrators can certainly stalk victims, but then there's also stalking by strangers, by friends, by relatives that don't have those elements. And people are often not going to identify as a stalking victim until well after, because stalkers are really good at what they do. And so they try not to be identified or noticed. And so someone might just have kind of that including feeling of like somebody's been watching me, or stuff in my apartment has seemed out of place, or I'm getting weird phone calls. You may also see people have increased security questions at the library. So it might seem like a lot when someone's coming up to the desk, like, where's the exit and who's allowed in? And do you have security here? And how far away is the police station? Those are people who are just trying to make sure that they're safe there. And they can seem like unnecessary questions for people who feel that the library is safe, but for someone who is constantly being monitored or watched and doesn't know who the person is, or when they may choose to identify themselves or escalate their behavior into more violence, it's really terrifying.
And be mindful about this with your library staff too. I have talked to several libraries over the years that have had staff stalked in their position at the library. So
yeah, absolutely. We had a very, very unfortunate situation in New Hampshire where a librarian was murdered in the library parking lot by a DV perpetrator. So I just like to, you know, really put it out there that today we're talking about patrons, but this is also impacting staff. And so using the same information we're talking about today to be kind and caring and compassionate to our fellow staff members is really, really important. There is no line for domestic violence where it's like, it happens to these people and then it stops. It happens in every community, to every gender identity, to every socioeconomic status, to every job. And it's important to remember that so that we can be creating a safe community for our staff members. So I also like to talk about how all of these things can impact diverse populations differently. The kind of general overview we just did is kind of the blanket understanding of domestic violence, sexual assault. And then when you add in being a member of a diverse population, things can get compounded because essentially it gives an abuser more tools to use to abuse you. It creates more barriers, more challenges. And so I just like to go over these briefly. You'll have the whole slides to review all of them. I'm not going to touch on every bullet point, but just to kind of bring some things to your attention. So this slide is specific to women with disabilities, and I'd like to do a disclaimer that it says that because that is what the study looked at. They looked at specifically women with disabilities, but a lot of what you see on here is going to impact anybody with a disability. They are going to have less reporting options because they may not have access to methods to report. They may not physically be able to make a phone call to 911. They may not physically be able to leave their home. They may be reliant on their caretaker, who is also the abuser, to get access to all of those things. And so they don't have any option to take care of themselves and get out of that situation. But specifically, women with disabilities are going to experience abuse for longer periods of time and by a greater number of perpetrators than a woman without a disability. For the LGBT plus community, this is where kind of my comment about additional kind of tools for an abuser to use comes in. So as we all know, things have kind of progressed and gotten a little bit better in some areas in terms of being out publicly, but it's still not safe for a lot of people. And so abusers might use threats of outing somebody to their family or to their work to keep them in control. They may withhold like gender transition medication, or they may be the only way that that person gets their gender transition medication. And so now they are tied to their abuser in order to live authentically in their body. And then this is a really, this is from a great book. It's Domestic Violence, Intersectionality, and Culturally Competent Practice. I recommend it to everybody. It has a lot of different chapters on different identities. I like to touch on this one because it reinforces kind of what we were talking about empowerment. This study found that African-American women really don't like to report because they don't want to participate in what in this book they've talked about as the prison industrial complex. And so not wanting to put people who have historically been abused by the criminal justice system through more of that, which is completely understandable, but it is another barrier for people in terms of accessing support and resources to leave a situation. And also this is another group where they don't find the term victim representative of their experience. And so this is where being really mindful of our language and using the language that somebody is using as they identify is really important. For immigrants and refugees, as I'm sure we can all imagine, being threatened with deportation is a huge tool for an abuser. I want to make everybody aware, in case you're not, that there are specific visas for crime victims. So if somebody is a victim of very specific crimes, there's a list on the website, but domestic violence is one of them. They can qualify for what's called a U visa, or if they're a trafficking victim, they can qualify for a T visa. It's important that we get this information out because it helps reduce that barrier. It helps reduce that tool that abusers can use against people who are here undocumented. And then for male identifying survivors, huge stigma around this. Toxic masculinity is real and very, prominent in our communities. And so there is this thought that like men can't be assaulted, or that they could have been able to stop an assault or should have been able to stop an assault. And it also feeds into this idea that men are perpetrators. Like the flip side of men can't be victims is because men are perpetrators. And so really making sure that we're using inclusive language when we're talking about things can build that bridge for these conversations about men who have experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. So why does any of this matter, right? None of you are going to school for social work or planning on advocacy, or maybe you are, which is great. And I would love to talk more about that. But why does it matter that we know any of this? If we don't have the information about how various forms of discrimination come together about different identities and groups, we can't make our policies inclusive. And so it's really important that we have kind of just a basic knowledge about these concepts so that we can make our policies inclusive. It is no different than understanding what teens want from their library or what your book group wants to talk about. It's just getting that basic understanding of how we can meet our patrons' needs. So Lynn Westbrook, who is a really great researcher who did a lot of kind of the forefront of information seeking behaviors in libraries for domestic violence victims, human trafficking victims. If you have the time, I really highly suggest reading her research. It's incredible. But she identified 6 unique information needs that survivors have. So stage 1 is when we are trying to figure out what abuse is. We think our relationship might be unhealthy. We're not quite sure. And so we're seeking out information about domestic violence, about what abuse is. Oftentimes for people, this is when they're learning that abuse takes a variety of forms in that power and control wheel. Sometimes people think, well, I'm not being hit, and so I'm not being abused. And then they gain information about that power and control wheel, that there are different ways of controlling somebody, different ways of abusing somebody, and they're learning that what's happening in their relationship is not okay. They may also be learning about leaving options, reporting options that might involve the police. and money information, because to leave, you need money. None of us can just pick up out of our life right now, drop everything we have, every asset, and leave, which is what victims have to do to be able to safely leave. Stage 2 is when somebody has transitioned to maybe living in a crisis center shelter, or they're involved with the criminal justice process. So they've maybe made a report. And there's a lot of different stuff that comes into this. They need to make sure their children are taken care of. They may need to relocate because it's not safe where they live. The abuser knows where they live. The abuser's not incarcerated or anything like that and has access to them. So they need to work on relocating to a safe place that's unknown to the abuser. They may need to be working on transportation. So in that power and control wheel with financial abuse, oftentimes perpetrators are making sure everything is in their name and nothing is in the victim's name. And this comes across as very caring. They say, well, I don't want you to have to worry about that. I don't want you to have that burden. I will take care of it. And what it does is it cuts the victim off from any asset they could possibly have to leave. And so trying to figure out a new vehicle or a new bus system is another thing that they have to figure out. The third stage is after they've left shelter or after they are done with their police involvement. So if somebody has gone into shelter, emergency shelter for relocation, fleeing from an abuser, they now need to figure out where they're going to live. They can't go back home. They can't stay in the shelter because it has maybe a limit on how long you can live there. And even if it doesn't have a limit, nobody wants to live in shelter forever, especially with children. It's a really traumatic place to live. It is chaotic. You are living with other people who are also having trauma responses. It can be really difficult to live in shelter. And so they have to figure out where they're going to live now. And how are they going to pay for that? Because most victims of domestic violence have not been allowed to have a job for a while, or they've been the primary caretaker of their children and have a huge gap in their resume. So they're figuring that out. They're figuring out, do I need to get some education to be able to get a job to support my family? And then they're also figuring out the basics. If we can check all those things off, right? We've got a house, we've got a job, I have the education to do this job. Okay, where do I get a couch? Where do I get beds for my children? Where do I get towels and dishes? Because all of that is left at the abuser's home when they flee. The fourth stage is probably the most complex one. So this is all the legal issues that go into leaving. So child custody, just because somebody has abused you doesn't mean they don't get to see their children. It's a really messed up rule. It's the same for sex assault in my state. Obviously, some of these things will vary state by state in terms of custody laws, but spouse can be found guilty of sexually assaulting their other spouse, and they still have a right to see their children. And so how do you legally navigate that? How do you keep yourself safe when you still have to have interactions with your abuser? They may also be getting divorced, trying to get their property back. Maybe they're trying to get some of the couch and the kids' beds into their new home. That all takes work. That's motions filed with a court. That is a judge having to rule on them. None of this stuff happens overnight. And so it's a really long process. I don't know if anybody here has done anything legally, but the system moves slow as dirt. And it is not a quick fix. And so being cognizant of that can help us have a little bit more patience for people who are really hyper-focused on some of these needs, because they're hyper-focused because they know it's not going to happen quickly, and they need a bed for their kid to sleep in now. We don't need it in 4 weeks when a judge rules that the abuser needs to give it back. They may also, and I like to talk about this, need to get information about their personal criminal record. We see very often victims of domestic violence who recant. So they come in and they say, I made a false report to the police. They never hurt me. They never touched me, and I should be charged. My office has a policy that we don't charge domestic violence victims with false reports to the police, but that doesn't exist everywhere. And so oftentimes domestic violence victims who recant end up with felony level charges for recanting against, what they had originally reported. And so that's something that they need to deal with when they leave the situation. They need to be able to get access to their criminal record, hopefully get a good lawyer to annul their record so that they can kind of work towards getting a better job. But those things have an impact long after somebody's left a relationship. And then they may have immigration related needs. So there is a very big difference between what we consider abuse in the United States and what is considered abuse in other countries. And so there is some knowledge and education that needs to happen around that. And then again, issues with immigration and residency. And they also have a lack of resources here. So if you think about things like food stamps and housing programs and some federally funded things, there are a lot of limitations on how much access somebody can get to those resources if they are undocumented or if they've immigrated. And so they are just going to be predisposed to have a harder time to leaving because they don't have access to the same tools that other people may have. And then the last stage is that all these stages can happen at the same time. So you can at the same time be trying to divorce somebody and get child custody and also find housing and also report to the police. These are not linear. It's like grief, right? And anybody who's experienced grief, you don't progress through the stages of grief in one swoop and you're done. You move back and forth. You may think that you have completed it and you are back at stage one. It is fluid. And it's important that we remember that because people have a lot going on when they leave a situation and they are all really important. All those things that I just listed, getting your divorce finalized, getting beds for your children, finding a job, those are all number one priorities. You need all of those things in order to be successful. And that's a really overwhelming task for anybody to do on a good day. And when you take somebody who is also trying to emotionally and mentally recover from leaving a relationship, from being abused for years, it takes a toll. And so just giving people grace and understanding that they're probably going through a lot and have a lot on their plate can help us kind of navigate through those crisis reactions and get referrals to them in a more helpful way. So the other cool thing about these stages that Lynn Westbrook did is it's a great way to kind of evaluate your library. So you can take one of these stages if you just want to get kind of a cursory glance of where your library is at and rate yourself. So for immigration related concerns, I did a survey and I asked libraries in New Hampshire to self-report how well they thought they met each stage, so all 6. And this is a graphic for the immigration related one. And so they all self-reported. Most of them didn't think they provided any information. And so if you think that you're kind of falling into that category, you can take a look and see, okay, how could we vamp that up? Is there a brochure we can post on the community bulletin page? Can we do a Facebook post? How can we kind of bridge that gap and kind of get us shifted a little bit more towards providing information? So now that we have a kind of general understanding of abuse, signs of abuse, and information seeking stages, what do we do with all that? So we're going to go through 3 scenarios. The first is if you receive a disclosure. The second is if you suspect a disclosure. And then the third is providing support to patrons as a whole. So the most important thing to know when you are receiving a disclosure is what your mandated reporting law is in your state. So in the state of New Hampshire, where I live, anybody over the age of 18 is a mandated reporter, which means if I know or suspect abuse, I am legally obligated to report that to our local child protective services. And if I don't, and somebody were to find out that I had knowledge of the abuse and didn't report it, I can be charged with a crime. So I like this little graph just because I think it can kind of clarify there's some confusion when it comes to like, okay, well, it's not clear that I'm a mandated reporter. If you are not, it does not mean you can't make a report. It just means you're not going to be charged criminally for not making that report if you had knowledge. But in the state of Mississippi, this is your law around reporting. So as you'll see in the beginning, there's a lot of very specific job duties that are listed, and librarian is not one of them, but it does say any other person having reasonable cause to suspect that a child is a neglected child or an abused child. So that means anybody who suspects has to report in the state of Mississippi. So it's really important that you're having conversations within, your library about what that is going to look like. Obviously, there's hierarchies within libraries. Is that the library director making all of these reports to CPS? Do the individual librarians who received a disclosure make it? Having a process identified is going to make it much smoother if you receive a disclosure and make you much more confident in what that process looks like. So when we report to agencies, they are going to request a variety of information from a caller. And it is not necessary to know every piece of information, but we obviously need to give people enough information to do follow-up. Oftentimes, if you're receiving a disclosure, it is not the first time that somebody has been called in to a Child Protective Service agency, and so they may have information on file already about a family. Typically, we tend to see people pop up on CPSW's radar, and then they'll fall off for a little bit because they've got services for a while, and then another disclosure or another concern pops up. And so you'll see people who kind of continue to have engagement with Child Protective Services. So you don't need to worry about having every piece of information, but just enough. And it's important that those conversations are happening with your library and your library policies, because we need to make sure that we are following our mandated reporting laws. And we also need to make sure we are following confidentiality of library patron records. And that is not a thing that I get to talk about today because I am not legal, but having those conversations within your library about what that looks like is going to be really important. So there's no confusion if you receive a disclosure. We don't want to be sitting with information that somebody's like actively being harmed and having to figure out like what we can do about that. If all of that is taken care of, you know you are making a report to a Child Protective Service agency. There are some things to keep in mind when you do that. So I don't recommend some of these things for kiddos, but I'll be really clear about who I recommend them for when we talk about them. So we want to make sure that people who are disclosing know that we are a mandated reporter. This I typically recommend for people who are teens, or like I would say like age 12 and over. And this conversation is just going to look very neutral. It's not accusing anybody of being about to disclose anything, but it is about keeping them safe and letting them make choices for themselves that keep them safe. Survivors know their situation the best. They know what is going to put them at risk, and it's important that we trust that. So if it sounds like somebody's going to make a disclosure to me, and I know I'm a mandated reporter, I might say something like, hey, what you're about to say sounds really important. And I just want to let you know that I'm a mandated reporter, which means that if I hear that somebody has thoughts of hurting themselves or hurting somebody else or is being hurt, I have to call that into a government agency. And I really want to hear what you have to say. I just want you to know that that's something I might have to do if what you're about to tell me falls into any of those categories. It's very similar to what therapists do when they give out their kind of statement of disclosure responsibilities, but it's important that we give them that little smidgen of control. The studies show that if somebody is ready to disclose, telling them that you're a mandated reporter is not going to stop them from telling you. But what it will do is help somebody make an informed choice, and it will help them build trust with you because you were honest with them about what you had to do with that information before they gave it to you. Not telling somebody, you run the risk of them feeling very betrayed that you shared that information that they may have thought was confidential when they told you. The other thing that we can do to help give them back a little bit of that control is ask if they want to be involved in the reporting process. Say, I have to make this report. The way I do that is I make a phone call and I give them some information. If you want to hear that information I'm giving them so you know exactly what I've said, I'm happy to have you sit with me while I make that call so you can hear it. And that lets them know exactly what we've told to an agency, and it reduces the ability of the perpetrator to misuse our words in a report. So when you make that report to a Child Protective Services agency and they start, working on their investigation with a family, abusers are good at what they do. They're going to twist and turn words. And this just kind of eliminates any confusion with the victim about what we have said. It keeps that clear boundary and it helps build that trust. So again, getting a disclosure, always aware of those mandated reporting laws. We're also going to use some active listening, and I'm going to talk really concretely about what that means during a disclosure, and then talk about when kiddos are disclosing. So for our active listening, we are focusing really hard on what that person is saying. to the extent that you can, because it can be really difficult to, take that information in and hear about something really terrible that's happening to somebody. We're not focused on ourselves in that moment. It's not, our narrative in our head cannot be, oh my God, this is so awful. I can't believe they're going through this. This is so sad. We can have all of those thoughts later, but right now that person needs our focus. It's also going to help you when you come time to have to make a report, if you have to, that you have that information. So we're just sitting and we're listening, and we want to show that we're listening. So we're not, while they're talking, we're okay. And just giving those little verbal cues that you do when you're talking to a friend to let them know that you're listening. And if we need to, we're going to ask clarifying questions. And this is a really fine line between asking a clarifying question so that you can assist them and asking a question that is kind of self-serving and for your own curiosity, or there is an inherent desire to understand people's situations. And so it may feel like a clarifying question when really it is our brain trying to process what they've said. So just like victims are going to experience trauma responses, we can experience vicarious trauma or secondary trauma hearing these stories. Your brain is going to have a similar reaction. It's going to go, whoa, this is a really bad thing, and I need to kind of have a way to file this in my head. I need to make sense of it. And so you may come up with questions that you want to ask so that your brain can process what's happening. But it's not, again, it's not about us right in that moment. And so just taking the time to be like, okay, is this a clarifying question because I need to understand this piece of information for when I make my report, or so that I can make them a referral that's more informed? Or am I asking because I'm just having a hard time understanding and need to process it myself? We skipped over kiddos, sorry. So when we are talking to small children, we are not making facial expressions ever. Again, this doesn't mean like deadpan stare at them, but we should not be making faces that look shocked or scared or sad. If we slip up and we make a face, we're going to address that, because kids are going to scan their environment to get feedback on what they're saying. Kids are oftentimes maybe not fully aware of the abuse that they're experiencing or how bad it is. And then when they disclose it to an adult, that is when they learn, because of how the adult responds, like how bad what is happening to them is. And we want to try to avoid that. We're not trying to scare kids. They're already going through enough. So we're human though. So if we make a face, that's okay, but we want to clear that up with them. So if I was talking to a kiddo who disclosed and I got a little teary-eyed because what they said was really, powerful and sad, I might say, hey, so I know that I look a little teary-eyed right now, and I just want you to know it's not because of anything you've done, and it's not because of anything you did. And you want to identify your feeling. I'm feeling a little sad because I'm sad that somebody hurt you and you didn't deserve that. But we want to really own our emotions so we're not accidentally kind of putting that back on a kid, because a kid could walk away from that interaction and go, I told them that, my parent was hitting me and I made them cry. And so I shouldn't tell anybody else because I'm going to make them cry. We want to own our emotions. We're the adult in that situation, and name it, because maybe they haven't seen healthy emotions being named. It's okay to have them, but that's not the place for them. So when we're responding to somebody, we've done the active listening, we've gotten those clarifying questions. Now it's our turn to kind of talk and engage in that conversation. What are we doing? So we want to honor the strength it took for them to tell us. That is a really big deal. If you think about something that has happened in your life that was a little bit scary or sad, it takes a lot to call somebody and tell them what's happening. And so we want to just acknowledge that. Just take a moment. I'm really grateful that you saw me as a trusted person to tell this to. Thank you. And then if we need to, we're going to go to a private spot. We're not talking in the middle of the busy library. Maybe we find a nice little safe side aisle to go chat in. Maybe you have an office that you can go to, but we want to just kind of keep that conversation private. It's nobody else's business what's happening. If somebody starts disclosing to you in the middle of the library and there's a ton of people, you don't need to interrupt them. But when it feels natural in the conversation, like, hey, why don't we go step over here so we can talk a little bit more privately? And we're always going to follow up with, how can I best support you? we do not know what is best for people. And this is where when we try to help can be actually really hurtful for people when we think we know what is best for them. It's, I feel like, very similar to my sister just gave birth. What I think might be helpful for her right now is not what she needs done. And so asking, how can I best support you? I get a list of things I wouldn't have even thought of that to her are way more helpful than me doing what I thought was helpful. And so we're just checking in with people. They know what they need. And they will ask for it when they need to. And so just making ourselves available. And then kind of the caveat to receiving disclosures is if it's a disclosure of previous trauma. So the first disclosure I ever got as a librarian was during a reference appointment. And it was a student who was taking like English 101, had a 4-page paper that they needed to write, and they came to the library to just get some research done. And so I'm just going through the regular old rigmarole of let's work on narrowing down your topic because every student starts way out here and we got to get them down here. And so I said, okay, what do you want to write your paper on? And she was like, I want to write it on the Congo. And I was like, cool, that sounds really interesting. What about the Congo? Because Congo's like, that's too wide for 4 pages. You're going to be able to write a whole novel about that. People do. And you don't want to be writing a novel. So what are we going to narrow it down to? Well, I'm really interested in child rape in the Congo. And I was like, great, that is definitely more narrow. So let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think we might be able to narrow that a little bit more too. Are we talking about like prevention methods? Are we talking about the rates? Are we talking about community organizations that are helping in the communities for issues around that? And so just trying to get her thinking of kind of these more narrow topics, because still child rape in the Congo is still a really broad topic to write 4 pages on. And so we're sitting there talking, and I was like, well, tell me a little bit, and this is where I went wrong as baby librarian. I was like, tell me a little bit about like what's interesting to you about this. And her response was, oh, well, I was born in the Congo and I was raped as a child. And so I just thought it would be easy to write my paper on it. And I was like, all right. She could have been telling me that she ate a peanut butter lunch, like sandwich for lunch. It was so neutral. It was so nonchalant. It was very clear that there wasn't tons of emotion tied to this, that this was something she had experienced, but had grown a lot from, and just really wanted to get her English paper done. Like that was all she wanted. She was like, I just want a topic so I can get this done. So it didn't become a big thing in our conversation. I didn't respond with, oh my God, that's so sad. Are you okay? That must have been really difficult. It's really important to kind of gauge people and where they're at, because that, oh my God, that's so sad. That must have been so difficult. That's my reaction. That's my brain processing what she said. What she experienced must have been horrific. And my brain was trying to like process that while also helping her find a topic for her paper. But it's not about me. It was about her. And she needed a narrow topic. And so we just switched gears and I said, all right, let's just see what we can do for a search and we'll see what comes up. And you let me know if there's something that like kind of piques your interest that's a little bit more narrow. And we went on with our day. So I just like to point this out because not every disclosure, especially when we're talking about disclosures of previous trauma, need a big, huge reaction from us. It's natural to want to do it, but it is not, for anybody who has lost somebody, it's kind of similar to when you tell somebody like, oh, so-and-so passed away. And then they make it this big thing and you're maybe not in the space for that right then. You're not in the space for feedback from other people about your loss. And so we're just gonna kind of go with how people are presenting to us. When it's about previous disclosures, people may be very neutral when they're talking about something they are currently experiencing, and that is different. But when we're talking about previous trauma, it is okay to kind of follow their lead about how they're engaging with that conversation. So when we're suspecting abuse, typically, we are not going to say anything about our suspicions to a patron. Certainly, there may be a time where perhaps it's a small town library or it's a patron who you've worked with for decades and you just know them and you can tell that something's off. Most often I give kind of this speech about suspecting abuse in relation to when we're concerned about a fellow staff member who we are friends with, who we know really well and are concerned about. So there's some things that we have to kind of figure out. We need to figure out how to talk to them safely, how we're going to say something, like what words are we going to use, and then how are we going to help them if we bring something up. It's really not fair to somebody to bring something up and then be like, well, that kind of sucks that's happening to you. Good luck with that. We need to be able to kind of assist them afterwards. And that may be with something that, you know, we follow up with them and say, how can I best support you with that? There's also some other referrals we might be able to make. So for safety considerations, we want to make sure the person is alone, that they're not going to be put in harm's way by talking to us or by taking information from us. So maybe at the end of this conversation with the person, they are really interested in contacting their local crisis center. It's important we find out how can we safely get that to them. Can I give it to you on a piece of paper? Do you want to change my contact in your phone and just like have my phone number be that phone number, but it says my name so that the person doesn't know if they look in your phone? Do I need to have you call from my phone so that it's safe? Do you need to call from the library phone? So we're just trying to make sure that we're keeping them out of harm's way when we have these conversations. Because again, if an abuser gets wind that a victim is going to leave, they are going to up their violence, they're going to escalate, and we want to ensure that we're not, you know, kind of causing that to happen. Here's some suggested language. There are a million different ways to bring things up to people, but it's important we're doing it in a trauma-informed way, that we are not being aggressive about it, that we are not pushing them too far with our conversation. Victims are hearing from abusers a lot of kind of that isolation language. So nobody will believe you if you tell them, nobody's going to care. And for somebody who may not be ready to acknowledge what they're experiencing, if we go at them too hard with a conversation, we go too heavy, they're going to withdraw from us. They're going to think that we're not a safe person. And then on the flip side of that is if they ever do come to a place where they realize what's occurring and they are ready to talk about it, they may not come to us because there is a lot of shame and guilt in, oh, well, that person asked me about this years ago and I wasn't ready to talk to them. And they're going to say, I told you so, or they're just going to blame me for staying so long. So we want to make sure we're really neutral in this conversation, that there's no value like placed on them doing any certain behaviors, that we're just leaving the door open of like, hey, I'm concerned about you. If you want to talk about that, I'm here. If there's anything else I can do to support you, please let me know. And then we want to be prepared to make a referral. Again, we're not leaving people hanging when we bring things up. We want to make sure we have something to offer, because I don't expect any of you to leave here and be, you know, pros at advocacy or all the connections in your community. You're not advocates at crisis centers, but we want to be prepared to kind of get them to the people that can assist them, which kind of lends into providing support to our patrons and community as whole. So this is almost, I call this like prevention. So library prevention with domestic violence and sexual assault. This is where we're working on educating our community and getting those resources out there. Because if we as librarians are maybe unsure about what resources are in our community, patrons certainly are going to be unsure about what is in their community for resources. And so we can kind of be that bridge for them. Support is going to fall into two categories. So we're going to talk about the environment. This is like the physical structure of your building. This is displays, like all of the concrete visible things that you can see. And then we have our culture. So what is our library culture like? How do people feel when they walk in their library? What are they hearing staff talk about? What does our engagement with patrons look like? So for our environment, approaching patrons in the stacks is huge, both in physically how we do it and what we're saying to them, and then how we do our displays and where we display crisis center information. So I like to suggest giving this kind of new language a try if you are kind of doing roaming reference, or just happen to be putting books away in a stack and maybe see somebody look a little confused in an area. Rather than asking them if you can help them find anything specific, which requires them to disclose to you what information they're looking for, and maybe they don't feel safe or comfortable doing that, we can kind of just give them an overview of where they are. This obviously doesn't work if somebody is not in a specific stack section, but if you see somebody and they just kind of look confused, it's natural to want to assist. That is great. Instead of saying, can I help you? You could be like, hey, I noticed you were browsing. If it's any help to you, we kind of keep books on cats here and on dogs here and domestic violence here and airplanes here. And if you need help finding anything else, please let me know. And before anybody comes at me, I know none of those books would be shelved in the same section, but it's just a little example. So we can give them information. We can kind of tuck those sensitive topics into our general overview, which could help them if they're looking for that. It also lets people know we are not uncomfortable talking about those books. We are able to go up to somebody and say, hey, they're here. We can put them in a neutral sentence, and it helps build that bridge with somebody. Survivors are deciding if they trust us before they ever talk to us. They are watching our behavior. They are watching how we talk to people and engage with people. And this can be a huge step in building that rapport with somebody who may be looking for sensitive information. They'll remember that next time they come in. That was a librarian who could, say the word sexual assault without stumbling over it. And I do have a question on that. And so I'm going to go ask them. For displays, we tend to have a display in one location. I know that this is because our libraries are small and that is what we tend to have for space. To the extent that you can, having a prominent and a private display for things can be really helpful. So maybe you have your more prominent display on domestic violence out. There's books, there's flyers, there's bookmarks, you have all of that in a really prominent area. And then you also maybe have a smaller one kind of tucked away, maybe in a corner near the restrooms, where somebody can take that information and not feel like every eye in the building is on them. It gives people an opportunity to get that information a little bit more anonymously. You can also, again, to the extent that your library is willing to do this, kind of do like no checkout books where people can take the book and it doesn't need to get checked out. Maybe it's a sensitive topic book. And so you have a few of those where they're on the honor system. Somebody takes it out and hopefully they bring it back. And if not, they got the information that they needed. You can also consider doing storage for lending. So those books that are on display, maybe it's not safe for somebody to bring that home. And so do you have the capacity in your library to have somebody check out a book so they still have access to that, but not have to bring it home? Can they store it at the desk for 3 days and come back and read that material in the building where it's safe? We also want to make sure that we are just being cognizant about what's going on those displays. So making sure that we are weeding our materials appropriately. When I was doing my research on New Hampshire libraries, I picked 3 random ones. It was really just to get some cursory knowledge. It wasn't for any statistical purposes, but just to look at what was in collections in domestic violence and sexual assault. And there was a lot of outdated materials. The unfortunate thing was if we had taken those outdated materials out of those sections, they would have been left with a really small collection. So just taking a look, do you still have books that call it spousal abuse? And if so, they go in the garbage. Just toss them out. We don't need them. It is, or wife beating. I saw one that was literally wife beating was the subject. And so making sure that we're taking out the books that use language that we are trying to steer away from helps create a more well-rounded collection and a safer place for people to get information. It's no different than if we weeded our maps and maybe the terrain has changed or those hiking paths aren't there anymore. It's not safe to give people that information. It's not safe to give people outdated books on domestic violence and sexual assault. So crisis center information. This is my #1 referral for everybody. They are the pros in your area about resources for domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking victims. And most often they have those little tearaway flyers where you can rip off a phone number, stick it in your pocket, and give them a call. And so those flyers, whether they're tearaway or they just have their name and information and kind of brief overview of services, those should be accessible to everybody. And by that, I mean they should be in every restroom. both male and female restrooms. If you have gender neutral family restrooms, they should be in every restroom, and they should also be in every staff restroom. And that is one that I think gets left out a lot. So the information needs to not only be available for our patrons, but for our staff. If we have a community bulletin board, should be up on there. If we have a reference desk, it should be posted there. I've seen some libraries that have rules about posters in the bathroom. My personal opinion is this one surpasses any rule about posters in the bathroom. It is critical information for people that's literally life-saving. And bathrooms are a great place for people to privately get that. Similar with having like a public and a private display, a bathroom is a really safe place for somebody to get that information without having people know. The one thing that I will say with having these flyers in restrooms is you need to check them pretty frequently. We had some issues at a community college I worked at where they kept getting vandalized. So people would just write really terrible things on the poster about people who needed those services. And so we made sure we checked them once a day. If they were written on, if they ran out of the little tearaways, we printed a new one and got it posted. The Crisis Center was like more than happy to send us their PDF. And so we just printed a new one every time we needed it. We didn't need to call anybody to get a copy. Most crisis centers have funding that is for like prevention materials, whether that's like pens and pins and bracelets, things that they can give away to kind of raise public awareness. And usually they have a giant box and they're more than happy to send some materials to a library to hand out, have on display. So they're a great resource in your community to reach out to for that. And then when we're talking about our culture, we're talking about creating safe space, building those really good relationships with a crisis center, and our language use. So for creating a safe space, we want to use a trauma-aware approach with patrons and staff. So we are being mindful of how we are presenting ourselves. We are being mindful of the things that we are saying. We are being open to people. We are leaving that door open for conversation. And we want to get feedback from people in our community about how we can continue to develop that safe space. So perhaps that is asking your crisis center who works with survivors in your area if they have any feedback about the library. If somebody were to identify as a survivor and had thoughts on, you know, your library, or maybe they had an interaction with a staff member that they were comfortable sharing, getting that feedback and then using it, like genuinely using that feedback to try and make shifts in your community. We are never approaching people from behind in the stacks. Sometimes this is unavoidable given kind of the setup, but if we are trying to move past somebody or get their attention, we're doing so well ahead of being like right behind them. Whether that is making noise, jingling keys, scuffing our feet, or verbally being like, hey, I'm headed up behind you, just wanted to let you know, so that people can have a chance to turn, they can get their body in a position that feels safe to them. But for somebody who has PTSD, like approaching from behind is just going to send off that adrenaline rush of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And we want to reduce that. That's not comfortable for anybody. Anybody who's experienced that knows that it can really kind of throw your day off to just be jolted into that experience. We also are never touching anybody. I mean, as a general good rule for like any patron or staff. But if somebody is dissociated or like non-responsive, it can kind of be a natural reaction to reach out and kind of like maybe rub a shoulder or get their attention or like pat a leg. We don't want to do that. That can create a really bad response for somebody who's currently dissociating. We also could put ourselves at risk for violence because somebody who's dissociating may not recognize you as a safe person. They are in their head in a bad space, and that touch may remind them too much of a person who hurt them, and they may respond as if you were the person who hurt them. And we also want to avoid boxing someone into a corner. So I've worked in a lot of libraries where stacks have lots of corners in them. We want to make sure somebody always has two exits. We don't want to ever force someone that if they want to leave the interaction with us, that they have to walk past us to get by in like a tight space. So the extent that you can, just again, being mindful of our bodies, being mindful of our space, and looking at it through a lens of somebody who may not feel safe in our library or who may have PTSD or kind of a trauma response. How can we make that situation easier for them? And I kind of touched on this a little bit, but collaborating with your crisis centers is a great way to work with your community. So they are on the front lines, they are working with survivors, they know what survivors in your area are encountering for barriers, what they need, and you can work with them on things like book displays. So do they have recommendations on new great books, whether for kiddos about abuse, for adults? Is there any good new movies that have like a fairly accurate depiction of domestic violence that's not sensationalized, that's more inclusive? Do they have programming suggestions? Maybe they collaborate with you on some local resources for like legal assistance. They can also do staff training. So they could expand on what we're talking about today and really hone it in on what is happening in your community. And they can also help you with policy development. So one of the things that survivors in shelter find as a very large barrier with the library is a library card. Almost all the time on your library card, I can't think of any place other than people who have made changes because of this issue where it doesn't ask for this, but it asks for your address. Shelters most often have a confidential address. So if I am a victim who's living in shelter and I want access to the library resources and I can't give you an address because I am prohibited from it by my contract in order to live there safely, how do I get access? How do I get access to your materials? Sure, I can be in your space and I can look at them there, but I have kids who are traumatized and need books to read at night so that they're not up screaming all night. Like, how do I get access to those materials? And so this is another great way to work with your crisis center. Perhaps the crisis center gets cards that are the business name on them and they're able to hand them out to residents, and residents get the books. And then their name's not tied to it, their address isn't tied to it. Perhaps you go on an honor system and somebody can just say, I live in the area and I'm not able to give out my address. And we just honor that and we give them a card anyway. There's a lot of ways to work around the card barrier, but it's important to have a plan. Just like for everything we're talking about today, it's important to have a plan, because could you imagine being somebody who's living in shelter, who's trying to come in and just get resources, and you can't tell them your address and the library staff member acts like you are like, they can't do anything for you. Well, I don't know what to do because you don't have an address and I can't give you a card, but you can pay $35 for an out of county card. Like, they don't have the money, they don't have anything. So just being prepared for that policy development and working with your crisis centers to do so can create leaps and bounds for survivors in your area and reduce those barriers. Language. So how are we talking in libraries? So a great example of this for right now that's kind of relevant is the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. It was really prominent in pop culture, on the news. It was natural to talk about that at work. I know certainly at my work, there were conversations about the trial and what was happening and the news coverage. Excuse me, but we want to be really mindful about how we're talking about topics that kind of intersect with sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, because people may not hear our whole conversation, right? So our whole sentence may have been really trauma informed, but like a small portion of that was not, or it didn't come across trauma informed, but that's all that patron heard when they walked by our desk. Or maybe you're gossiping with a coworker and you're kind of going back and forth, well, I don't know, I kind of believe Amber Heard, but I kind of believe Johnny Depp, and here's the reasons why I believe them, and here's the reasons why I believe them. And another staff member who's experiencing violence is now learning what you use to measure credibility or authenticity in abuse. And so we just want to be aware of how we are talking about these things, because again, people decide if we're trustworthy before they ever talk to us. Nobody just walks into a library one day or into their work and is like, pick that person, I'm going to go tell them my deep, dark secret. No, they're gathering information about us before they ever come and see us. And then the other thing that I like to talk about is linguistic avoidance. For anybody who hasn't ever heard of this, this is the way that we talk and the way that we don't talk about things that we're talking about. It's where we place blame and focus in conversations, and you will see it a lot in news. You will see it a lot in data. And so I like to give some examples of what we usually say, because we have been conditioned to talk this way by our culture, and how shifting that even just a smidgen makes a huge difference. So when we're talking about like data, the stat that, So 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted, or every 46 seconds a woman is raped. The focus is on the victim. And this is how we have predominantly had conversations about sexual assault. We have put the focus on the people who are sexually assaulted rather than putting the focus on the perpetrator. But the way that that sentence changes when we shift the focus and say every 46 seconds a person rapes a woman, it puts the focus on the people who are causing that harm. It takes away the focus on the victim. And so by doing that, we create these little micro shifts in how we look at things. Those implicit bias activities that we did at the beginning, none of us were born into this world and just like thought our initial thought. We were cultured to do that. And it was through things like the way we talk about things or don't talk about things that we're talking about. And so just making those small shifts also helps retrain our brain. It helps retrain those neural pathways to be more inclusive, to really focus on what is at issue. It's not people who are assaulted, it's the people who are out assaulting people that we should be focusing on. What we say matters. Again, when we are talking to people in our library, when we are, if your Facebook's public, what you're posting on your personal Facebook page, all of that stuff matters. And so what I'm going to show you on the next slide, I want to be really clear, is not bashing librarians. I think it's really important that we see the kind of spectrum of things that people say. So when I did my research in New Hampshire, I sent a survey out to every library in New Hampshire that was a public library. And these are a handful of responses I got from library staff members, often directors, in response to my survey. And these are the people who felt comfortable sharing these statements. So I'm sure there were people who had similar thoughts, worse thoughts, who didn't email me, but these people felt so confident and comfortable in their thoughts about my research and even like daring to ask the question of how are we providing services to survivors, that they sent me these responses with no shame, no second questions about it, just sent them away. So I'm going to give you a minute to read them, and then I just want to process a few of them a little bit. So one of the ones that jumped out to me, they all jumped out to me, that's why they're on this slide. But out of these, there are occasions when it is appropriate to reveal a book title to a family member, but generally speaking, we respect privacy. So this was a library director in my state who clearly feels no qualms about releasing information about book titles to family members of a patron, which, as we've talked about, could be like very dangerous if that person is checking out sensitive materials, whether that is about domestic violence, whether it is about your divorce proceedings in your state. Like there is a variety of things that someone may not want a family member to know. And in this town, it is not safe. It is not safe to check out books because the library staff have decided that it's okay to release information to family members. I really suggest having a very specific policy in your library, if you don't already, about releasing information that is in writing. Abusers very easily could get a victim under duress to give permission for information about their account to be released, or for it to be okay for an abuser to pick up their materials, things like that. And so just having a really concrete plan in your library about like how you determine if those things are okay and how you can assist in kind of keeping those lines clean in case it is somebody who is under duress, who is only agreeing to give that information out because they are being abused and controlled. How can we kind of bridge that gap? Maybe the answer is we just never do it. We just never allow spouses to pick up a partner's books. We never allow somebody to put a hold for somebody else. Like, whatever that looks like in your library, it's just important to think about because it is really dangerous in very specific situations for somebody to know what somebody is checking out. A lot of times there's no harm. There's absolutely no harm in somebody knowing that I checked out the latest like James Patterson novel, but it could be dangerous. And those are the situations that we want to prepare for and have good policies around. The other one is that advocates should just reach out to the libraries if they want to help. Advocates are doing all the work, just like all of you are in your libraries. They are on the ground with these victims. They are at the hospital while they are getting sex assault kits done. They are helping them actively flee. They are filing court paperwork to keep victims safe. Like, they are busy keeping people safe day in and day out. They overall, from every advocate I've ever worked with, are more than happy to help their community do prevention methods, to get the word out about their services. But the nature of their job is crisis work. So they may have been meaning to work with the library for the last like 2 years. And then it's just been crisis after crisis after crisis, and it's kind of slipped on the back burner. There is nothing wrong with reaching out to your crisis center just to get it back on that front burner. Like, hey, we really want to assist. The work that you guys are doing is incredible, and we want to make sure we're supporting you and our community patrons. And so let us know what that might look like. How can we best support you? And having those conversations can really help build that community bridge between you and a crisis center, and also help your patrons. It is, not any one person's job to help survivors. It is all of our job. That is how we keep people safe. And I mean this not just as librarians, but just as human beings in our community. Like, it is going to take every single one of us being working on prevention and education and changing our language to change the way that our culture looks at these issues. And so it's not just an advocate's job. The other thing that I like to touch on is in the small town that I'm currently working in, it has not been a concern. As we've talked about, domestic violence, sexual assault happens everywhere. The thing that I want to talk about with this quote is I received this email, and then pretty shortly after received some survey responses from survivors. And one of the survivors said, I didn't go to my library to get access to resources because it was a small town library and the librarian knew my abuser. And so at the same time that librarians are saying that this is a small town, and so we don't have issues like that, survivors are saying, I'm not safe in my small town because everybody knows everybody. And so we're kind of have those varying ends of like, we're not going to acknowledge this as a problem, and this is such a problem that I'm like not even safe at my library. And so just being aware of those community connections. Abusers are so good at what they do. They convince people that they are good people. And so you very well may get a disclosure for someone, and the person that they say is hurting them, you have a really hard time believing that. And that is okay, but that is what abusers do. And we have to check ourselves. It is okay to be shocked or stunned by that. It is not okay to then question a victim because of your response. Abusers manipulate everybody in their community so that they can get away with what they're doing. So after all of these things, whether we receive a disclosure, whether we're suspecting abuse, or if we're providing support to our patrons and community as a whole, we are making referrals. And people, when I've talked about this, librarians get really nervous about this because they're like, well, I'm not an expert in these things, and I don't know everything, and that is totally normal. It is no different than when we're making a referral to another book or to the tax form that somebody needs. We just get that kind of baseline understanding of what is available in our community, and we make our best referral based off of that. Nobody is expecting you to be an expert, but I think because of the nature of the referral, that it is such a heavy and serious topic, people get really anxious about doing it wrong. And so I just want you to hear from me. You already do this all day, every day. It is just a little bit of a different topic. When we're making our referrals, we want to make sure that we have some of this knowledge so that we know some specific things about how resources in our area are like impacted by different types of violence, and then what our referral is. Like, what are we going to send people to? So for violence-specific information, there are resources in your community that are going to be dependent on what somebody is experiencing. So what I mean by that is like somebody going to get a sex assault kit, if they're doing that for reasons other than like checking out their body, so they're hoping that there's evidence to preserve, things like that. After 5 days, there's nothing left. So I can't imagine a scenario where somebody is asking the librarian to refer them to a hospital for a sex assault kit. But this is just an example of where like that violence specific information comes in. So if somebody said that and it had been, they're like, it happened 2 weeks ago. A kit isn't gonna, they're not even gonna do one at that point, but it's really important to get your body checked out. And here's the name of the local hospital that's closest here. We also want to be aware of the constraints on the system. So, which are everywhere right now. There's constraints on libraries and police and EMS and the crisis center advocates, the court system, and knowing where those constraints are, or just keeping your ear peeled for like feedback from people about what their experience is after they've gone to a specific service can help you kind of shift where you're going. So as an example, in my job right now, I refer people a lot to New Hampshire Legal Aid. They offer free consultations. I most often refer that for domestic violence victims who need some of that civil legal assistance in terms of figuring out child custody, divorce, stuff like that. I got a lot of feedback from people that New Hampshire Legal Aid was not returning phone calls because they had reached max capacity and weren't taking any more clients. The easy solution in my job right now is to continue referring people to legal aid because that is the place that I know. But I also know that that's not working for people. And so rather than sending people there, we're finding alternatives. And it can take a little bit more time to find something that is available and works, but it is better than sending somebody to a resource that I know is just not available for people right now. And when we are making these referrals, it's really important to know there was a great study done about how effective our referrals were in informal networks. So community conversations, things that are outside the realm of like police and hospital referrals. We are only effective when the person that's giving that referral has prior knowledge of a resource. So what they found is it is not enough for you to say, let me go look up the phone number for the crisis center. If somebody asks for it, you need to readily be able to say, I have that phone number right here, and pull a pamphlet or pull a business card. People are statistically using those resources more when we are able to say, here you go, rather than let me go look that up, which I think is fascinating that just such a small shift is getting people to resources. And there, isn't a whole big answer on why that's different, but it is, and that's okay. And so it just helps us change our narrative. So making sure that that information is available at every reference desk, at every checkout point can allow you to have your staff say, here you go. And then we are then more effective in getting people to those resources that they need. Your number one referral. So my suggestion for anybody who's coming in with questions about domestic violence, sex assault, those resources in your community is going to be your local crisis center. So there is a wonderful map of who provides services in Mississippi. There are 4 counties that are not covered. So if you are in those counties, definitely reach out to me and we can try and figure out what works best for you. But I'm hoping most people fall into somewhere that is covered. So things to think about. If you are if you provide services in a county where there's a shelter, so even though, so let's say like House of Grace kind of covers like top left, their shelter might only be in Panola. And so that may be the only place that is impacted by the address issue of I have an address that is confidential and can't get a card. So taking a look at that, and then also working with them on that staff training. And then they also have a bunch of resources online. So they have online trainings that are not necessarily live that you need to go to. They just have online PowerPoints and presentations and article recommendations. And so that can be a really great way to get information about what's happening in your community. Because I'm here today and we're talking kind of generally about how these things impact, but there is going to be really specific information about your community's experience of violence that will help you kind of hone in your focus and hone in your services. So one example is in the county that I live in now. We got a lot of feedback from the crisis center advocates that on top of all of the other horrific things that go along with domestic violence and sex assault, there was a church in our county who was having sex assault survivors apologize in front of their entire congregation for cheating on their spouse. And this happened to multiple survivors on multiple occasions where they were having to go and basically, for their faith, apologize for adultery when that is not what happened. And so what we learned from that feedback from the crisis center is that our community needs a lot of education around kind of what is and what is not cheating, and that sex assault is not cheating, and some religious support around that. And so we've had some victims who've come through the criminal justice process who came from those churches who are really struggling with their faith because their faith didn't acknowledge what happened to them. And they are struggling with, how do I still be a person of faith when like my community of faith failed me? And so that's an avenue that we weren't expecting to have to navigate. And so I, as an advocate, had to learn a lot of resources around that and how to get people support for that. And so you might find that there are unique things like that in your community that you wouldn't have thought of before. And so that's why it's really helpful to reach out to the people who service your area and say, what's going on? Like, how can we support people? What needs do you see that need to be met? And then how can we as a library meet them? You're not going to be able to meet every single one, and that's okay, but how can we assist with, what we have available? And then I am going to close out with 2 slides that are survey results from what survivors said when I asked them about library use for information seeking and things like that. So the first 2 statistics, I think, say a lot about where we can improve as libraries as a whole. So 76% of the survey respondents did not use their library to access information about abuse or through any part of the leaving process or anything like that. And then I asked them why, and 72% weren't aware that the library was a resource. They were not aware the library had books on domestic violence and sex assault. They weren't aware that the library could refer them to a crisis center. They weren't aware that the library had access to internet that they could use to safely communicate with the crisis center. And so that is a huge barrier that we can work on overcoming. Just getting that knowledge out in the community that we are there as a safe space, that we have access to those referrals and resources so that we can get people that information that need it, so that they know that they can come to the library and get that. And then I asked survivors what they wanted to see, because as much research as I've done, I am not a survivor. I am not somebody who can sit here and say that X, Y, or Z would be most beneficial in a certain situation. And so I think it's important that we listen to survivors. Again, how can I best support you? And so here is an actual concrete list of what survivors would like. So they want those more brochures and guides. They want that information. So how can we get that in our library? Is it more community bulletin boards? Is it more flyers in the bathroom? Is it an online guide that we can have available? They want online resources. They expressed a lot of difficulty with getting access to physical materials, especially in the context of somebody who's fleeing domestic violence. The last thing they want on their mind is to remember to return a book. That's not going to happen. They have other safety concerns to deal with. And so having those online resources, things like Libby and other online avenues to check out books is really helpful for survivors. Having a support group meeting space was also something that I thought was really unique that I wouldn't have thought of. And kind of the basis for this is it's a safety issue. So maybe it's not safe to go to the crisis center for a support group, but maybe they can get to the library. Maybe they can go to the library for an hour, and that is a neutral place to their abuser. It's not going to set off any red flags, and they can safely have a meeting at the library with crisis center staff and get the support that they need. Because I think it's important to remember victims can get access to crisis center services. Typically, there's some exceptions, regardless of whether they're leaving their abuser or not. So oftentimes crisis centers are supporting victims in staying. They're helping them stay safe while they stay until it is safe for them to leave or until they decide they want to leave. There is not a rule most often that you have to leave your abuser to get access to those services. So it's important that we remember that people could be engaging with those services across a whole spectrum of safety issues. They also wanted more staff training on awareness. So A+ for all of you, because you're here today getting that. More flyers with the crisis center information. So again, in the bathrooms, on sides of stacks, where you can fit them. They also want a contact list of sources that can help. So maybe you have an FYI page with legal resource, crisis center, court information, local police. It's just kind of a little handout of handy phone numbers. and they wanted materials for kiddos who had witnessed violence. That's a really hard concept to explain to a child about what's happening. And there's a lot of really great books out there that are written for kids who have witnessed domestic violence from a variety of different perspectives. Most of them that I have seen follow kind of a heteronormative narrative of dad assaulting mom, but certainly there is a little bit of variety there. And so just making sure that we have those available, because people in our community need them, whether we want them to or not, they do. Confidential consultations is one that I also think is really, really fascinating that somebody asked for. It seems like a no-brainer when you hear it, and but was not something I would have thought of. And so all of these suggestions are just that. They are just suggestions. You have to figure out how they're going to work best in your library, because there are pros and cons to each. The confidential consultations is one of the ones that I immediately comes to mind as like having huge pros and huge cons. One is a time constraint. The other is safety for a library staff member. We all have at least one, if not more, people who try to come into the library, look at pornography, look at weird stuff on the computer. Could you imagine that person having a confidential consultation sign up and then having a private space with perhaps a female library staff member and having to answer all of their questions about like weird sex stuff? We're not doing that. It's not the purpose of confidential consultations. But if it's somebody who needs maybe access to domestic violence information, sex assault information, so how do we get this tool accessible to the right people and not to people who are going to abuse the privilege, or for people who are abusers who want to then use this kind of against victims? So just thinking about how you can practically put these into place in your library. And sometimes the answer is you can't, and that's okay. We're not here to offer everything. It's all about making those minor changes, because if you think about how minor our language use is, right? The way we talk about domestic violence and sexual assault, it has shaped so much of our thoughts about those topics, and it's nothing blatant. Imagine the change that we can have if we make minor shifts in the opposite direction. How much more inclusive we can be, how much more open we can be, how much more trust we can build with our community. It is small changes. It is not big changes that are going to do this. So keeping that in mind, that we don't need to be superheroes. You already all are, but we don't need to be superheroes in overhauling our library. It really is like, pick one small thing to change and start there and see how it works with your library and your community, and then keep going. And then they also asked for like greater visibility of physical materials. So perhaps that is forward facing some books in the domestic violence section to kind of help it stand out, or sex assault. Just kind of how can you make those materials a little bit more visible?